Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Alchemy Lab. I'm Matt. I'll be your alchemist this evening. And I'm joined by author and all-round editor and other things, MarQuese de Liddle. MarQuese de Liddle. MarQuese de Liddle. We'll go with that. How you doing, man?
I'm doing well. How are you, Matt?
Yeah, good. Pretty good. All right. So for people who don't know who you are you and what do you do?
All right, so you know my name, MarQuese Liddle, pronounced with a flat S, but no one here in Wheeling, West Virginia, where I live, knows how to pronounce my name. So you, wide internet, pronounce it however you want. I am an author and editor, and kind of this internet self-styled philosopher, if I want to be pretentious, which I often am. So I write primarily fiction. I have a deep love for fantasy fiction, though I do want to broaden out here eventually. I do freelance editing as a probably at half my income. The other half is ghostwriting. So do that too. So if you want someone to ghostwrite your story, I am the spook for hire for you. What else do I do? Put out a bunch of stuff. I've been running a podcast for the past, I don't know, 20 some weeks. I don't know. It's probably been more than that, spread out. Talking about writing, or also just talking about any topics that I find of interest, as anyone I find interesting. And I've been putting out stuff on my YouTube channel, including goofy stuff like me eating 100% cacao powder. You can go check that out. I put that out today. Someone was giving me a hard time about it, so I had to demonstrate my capacities there. So yeah, all around, I don't know, jack of all trades, master of none, I guess.
Okay, so we have the podcast here on the channel, which is Wild Owl Literature. Also over here we have the website, also wildowllit.com. And there seems to be a whole litany of things up here. Stories, reviews, essays, aphorisms, etc. And we have I guess the novel in question. And yeah, here and see what else is around. Okay, the novels in
Oh, I didn't
question.
know
There's a
that still
couple of
showed
them.
up. Ooh, salt's
It's
in the
still
blood.
there.
I don't like to think about that.
There's
No, I don't.
only
I wish it wasn't.
there's only 3 of them left, so pick them up if you want to pick them
Uh,
up. All right.
yeah, I probably should.
Okay. Right. So, fantasy then. You gravitate most towards fantasy. Why? Why fantasy?
Um, that's a good question. I actually thought about this the other. I think about this quite many days. So, go to a local gym. A lot of let's say it's affiliated with the local hospital, so a lot of elderly people there, and there are a lot of old ladies reading. And I know I pay attention to what they're reading, and fantasy is something that they're not interested in. And I like to approach things sometimes instead of directing like why X, it's why not X, and then work backwards from there. Because why not is a little bit easier to answer. And I think the aversion to fantasy comes with the assumption that it is childlike or irrelevant to life. And I don't think that that's true. I don't think that's true because entire civilizations built up, their mythologies, and they knew what they were doing. Like, just go and read some of Plato, and you can understand, like, they knew they were trying to understand life through the mythology. Now, I'm sure as it gets more primitive than in ancient Greece, the belief was also literal, and obviously with this is systematization. I can't even say the word systemizing of religions. That's definitely interpreted literally. But why am I drawn to fantasy? I think it touches on the magic and the imaginative and the dreamlike qualities that we have as children when we're seeing the world anew, and we can see something closer to how the world is as opposed to what we project the world to be. And I don't know, I can't explain it more than that, but when you get to the level of the fantastical or the mythological or the folkloric or the dreamlike, whatever you want to call it, this is true of science fiction quite a lot as well, because it's also imaginative, any form of speculative fiction. There's this deep emotional resonance that I feel with it. I'm communing with some ancient spirits of bygone ages, in the past. And that's my big pretentious answer.
Okay. Okay. I suppose fantasy for me kind of it draws upon imagination far more than I mean even far more even than sci-fi does. I mean it draws upon my imagination a lot more. And the whole process for me is something I enjoy. Like the whole like going from kind of the nuts and bolts of this world that you have to invent and think up the rules for and what makes it different and what makes it the same and who inhabits it and what do they believe and why and is there something to those beliefs or is there not and how is the world functioned, how is it functioning now, how maybe will it function in the future, things like that. I find that really energizes me a lot more than I mean, at least to write energizes me a lot more than other things might. I think sci-fi has that as well. I think the difference with sci-fi is, at least in my approach to it, I try and be a bit more. I try and ground it a little bit. So the thing with sci-fi is there's the sci in it, which sort of, at least to me, in my mind, it makes me want to be a bit more kind of like, okay, let's actually really nail down more of the physics of things and nail down what is I don't know how things work and have that kind of based in definite like a definite kind of science theory. But in some cases you can't really do that because you've got things like faster than light where science tells us that it's not possible to go faster than light unless you have infinite energy. So it's yeah, you kind of have to bend it a little bit, but they follow similar principles of kind of high adventure, and I like high adventure, and I like creating stuff. It's just always been something I enjoy. So when it comes to your fantasy, which is as it stands, I mean there are two books here, but we won't talk about one of them. So with One Smoke, what's going on there? So let's
in terms of the world building.
In terms of so let's go in terms of what's going on in the book, and then we'll kind of move into the world building a little bit.
All right, so the basic plot rundown is you have a couple of outcasts living outside of a small coal mining town. Imagine something like maybe late 17th century. So by coal mining, I mean people crawling in a cave in a tiny tunnel and chipping away at a coal deposit somewhere down there. So this is rather in a impoverished setting. It's very, very dark. Very, very heavily influenced by probably where I grew up, my hometown, which we'll get into. But in terms of the plot, you have the two outcasts. One is a blind man who's a descendant of a cave-dwelling peoples who people call troglodytes, and they don't associate them with the rest of humanity, but really they're just short albino people who lived in caves who eventually went blind from generations of not really needing to see. And a little girl who what they call the serpent's curse, which is really a exaggerated form of psoriasis. It's almost like psoriasis crossed with leprosy, not quite as bad as leprosy, but her skin is constantly cracked and bleeding and hypersensitive to the sun, and so she's in constant pain, and everyone thinks that she's cursed and it's going to spread to them. So she's outcast. Don't ask, or you can if you want ask about what happened to her parents, because that's like a real heart wrencher. But these two kind of bond together in this pseudo cult, the cult of the Black Flame, and they plan a revenge on the town for casting them out. And the long and short of the plot is, as they investigate into occult magic as a means, a vehicle to deliver this vengeance, they start to uncover what the actual results are of delving into a kind of amoral or immoral means to whatever your goals are. And they see the people around them in their various states of depreciation, degeneration, despair, particularly, and end up deciding, maybe that sucks. Maybe I don't
Mm.
want that to be my life. And steadily they move in the opposite direction. They integrate themselves into society, and by the end, they're kind of these small town heroes. And that's how I would describe the plot of the book.
Mm. Okay. Right. Okay. Well, I would say spoiler alert, but it's one of I guess there's no you've not got into any real detail there, so it's sort of like okay, the you'll find out the journey by reading the story. Um, okay, so you mentioned it's a dark. So it seems quite compact. It seems like you kind of focused on a lot of fantasy can kind of go grand and go kind of like nationwide or even worldwide in extra epic kind of fantasy, but you seem to have like grounded it down into this town and maybe surrounding area, including this cave where they are. And you mentioned you based it on your hometown, kind of.
A little bit, yeah. There are a lot of similar elements. The presence of rivers and mountains. I live in West Virginia. There are
Hmm.
lots of those. I live very close to the Ohio River. It would not take me very well if I was in condition to run right now. It would not take me very long to jog over to where the Ohio River is. And mountains are just everywhere. And it's a small town, right? We've got like 25,000 people roughly. And it's just funny because that's a city for West Virginia, for all
Hmm.
of you out there in the world, right? Um, but yeah, the story, it does explore the rest of this island. That also comes from where I live. I grew up on a little island in the middle of the Ohio River, actually, as a kid, all the way up till I graduated high school. And so the
Hmm.
idea, it's funny to being on an island with rivers and mountains around it. It seems kind of odd, but that's the landscape I grew up.
Hmm. Was there like a
And
town
then,
on the island, or was it just?
yeah, there's well, right now mostly it's like there's like a strip of fast food places. There's a casino on one end, and on that end is, generally speaking, the poorer end with more crime. I can tell you some stories about that if you want. And then the
Hmm.
other end is like the elderly population who happens to still live on this island, and the remnants of where essentially the rich used to live when Wheeling was the capital of West Virginia. It was more than like 100 years ago now.
Hmm. Right. Okay. Hmm. Okay. Right. Okay. So it's based more on. Okay. So is it based more on that then? Okay. So the town in the story is based more on this town on the island.
Sort of the presence of the island is in the fact that, like, West Virginia is infamous maybe for just being a bunch of coal miners,
Mm.
poor ones at that. The hills of West Virginia actually aren't that rich in coal compared to, let's say, Virginia to the east.
Mm.
And that is definitely present, right? Where you have essentially somewhat rural folk. There's a difference between someone out on a farm and a coal miner. A coal miner is much more similar to a factory worker in a
Mhm.
sense, right? Where you're going into a place where you have poor working conditions for long hours, and then you end up with some debilitating condition, and you don't really retire because you die of, like, I don't know, black lung.
Mhm.
um, the presence of smog in the air from there, you have all these coal mines, coal burning plants. The air here is not the cleanest, and I think that contributed to the presence of a substance in the story called miasma,
Mm.
which covers the top half of the island. It's like this acidic poison mist that appeared about 300 years ago at the beginning of the story, and just essentially humanity had to flee wherever it was. And as the story progresses, you find it's very slowly spreading, which is not good, right? Not good for the South, which is the name of the town, by the way, that they live in.
Mm.
It's called South because it was the last settlement south of the mountains where the miasma came from. That's
Mm.
still there, right?
Right.
So it's like a kind of funny name because it's on the northern half of the island, which part of me enjoys just because I like to make the reader pay attention, right? So the town's
Mhm.
called South, and if you're not paying attention, you don't know where you are. um, yeah, I would say it is a focus setting though, to answer your question. They do expand outward. They take little adventures to the other cities, which are a few days walk away or a day or so boats ride down the river. Um, that's a little bit like living here in West Virginia. You've got like little pocket civilization. You drive a few miles down, like say the interstate, and then you've got another little pocket, and then between that, it's like woods and just wilderness.
Hmm.
Which is kind of weird if you're, in a mega or large metropolitan area. Metropolitan, I don't know if it's the right word. Metropolis. You're used to city, 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 city. It's not like that. It's like a bunch of houses and businesses for like a couple miles, and then just you're in the wilderness. And if you keep going like south from where I live, you hit wilderness for a long time.
Hmm.
And so that definitely affected the setting for Lawn Smoke.
Hmm. Okay. So I think that when I've been building, particularly the world of the Four Guardians, it's been based on so many different kind of nations that I've lived in. Like there's elements of kind of Mongolia to it, and there's elements of Hungary to it, and is there any Italy? Yeah, a little bit of kind of the sort of Italian, like southern mountainous areas. Actually, it's interesting you talk about the kind of troglodytes in your story and that they lived in caves. Where I lived in Italy, there's a town called Matera, which it's a bit more on the map now because a bunch of movies have been filmed there. I think they filmed Wonder Woman there. I think the start of the latest Bond movie was filmed there. They had like a car chase all around it and stuff like that. It would have been a really short car chase because it's not a big town. But people there used to live in the caves. So there's like a canyon. On one side of it is Matera, like the old city, and then on the other side of it is just all these caves in the hill. And people used to live in there and in these houses, which had no plumbing or anything like that, up until something like the 1930s. And it was just like, how? How did they live in there? And they preserved some of them. And it's like they just had like all the like the farm animals they had stayed in the house with them. Like they're on this just in this box, basically, with everything you have and everyone you know, and you're just in there and you go out and you just get on with it. And it's like just little things like that. Like how on earth when you see something like that, you think, how on earth did you survive for as long as you did? And then you realize you kind of learn why, and you're like, oh, noted. And that'll find its way into a book somewhere, I imagine. And yeah, living in Hungary as well, a strange energy there. It's a place that's been invaded so many times. It's got a kind of very, I don't know, it's just got this very patriotic, I suppose, is part of it. I don't know. There's just a sort of it's a sort of very dry patriotism to it, I think. And it's something I wanted to kind of try and, I don't know, look at in that respect. Because in my work, the nation of Harma, which is where the majority of the Four Guardians is set, that's a place that's been under occupation for a century. So what are the people like after that amount of time? And it raises some difficult questions for kind of how have you survived under occupation? We've probably done some pretty awful things, and to what degree has that affected your soul in a sense? And when difficult questions like that come up, answering them can be a real catalyst in your work to make something richer, I guess. So when you were writing One Smoke, what difficult questions were coming up, and how were they? If we can get into it without spoilers, how were they? How did you approach answering them?
All right, so yeah, that's actually what difficult question. That's kind of the myth that I have of writing, right? So I go into a story with a question that I do not have an answer to. And so this is a bit of world building detail, but part of the reason Conti is a troglodyte is because he is, you know, that archetype that we associate now in the modern day with, the guy who lives in his mom's basement, right? Like the loser who never launched himself, who is just lingering by, um, who's underground, who can't face the light, who doesn't have vision to see, right? That's why he's blind. And part of the question is, okay, there's a bunch of questions, right? Because once you're that guy, how is it that you come out of that position, right? If you are, what's I like to use the kind of mythological or religious terminology. It's, if you're possessed by the spirit of revenge, if you have this deep-seated desire to lash out at a world that you feel like has dealt you a bad hand, and the people who perhaps justifiably have mistreated you, not like they're justified in mistreating you, but you're justified in being upset about because you actually have been mistreated along with the misfortune of your own existence. How is it that you come out of that without succumbing? I think that was the initial question with Conti. It's how the hell do I get out of this? And it actually developed into a question that's a little bit harder to answer. And it's, how is it that I accept, like if I'm Conti, I'm asking, how is it that I can accept the misfortune, accept the mistreatment, and but to do that, I have to accept the fact that I'm a loser, right? And that's like that's the true step one, and that is so incredibly difficult. Now it sounds easy. It's like, well, you just like look at yourself and say, well, I'm not doing too great, and like I should do better. But no, 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 that's not how people are. People do not function that way. I did not function that way. Um, and I think part of what the Conti story was going back and reflecting on, um, my own. I had a probably half a decade's long struggle with depression and doing something with my own life, and we can get into that if you want. But I think that was really the question. The theme the theme would be the answer to this question. How is it that I can accept myself in such a way that I can also remake myself and self overcome? That might be the way to put it.
Okay. Right. So is he alone in the cave in the beginning?
Conti, in the very beginning of the story, no, actually, he's already, you know, uh, let's say, started to, perhaps for a year, probably a little longer than a year, taking care of Broken, which I think is really important. I don't think the story could be told without her there as a kind of what's the right word? Like Conti needed some responsibility, right? And he needed to be able to be responsible for someone else, because it's easier to be responsible for someone else than it is to be responsible for yourself. And when you're self-improving, you need to take the easy step first. If you can't take the easy step first, you will falter and fail when you try to take the bigger one, because you're not ready. It's trying to pick up a weight heavier than you can lift, right? Maybe you could do it, but you can't keep doing it.
Right. It's interesting. So at the beginning of the story, Conti and Broken have met, and they know each other, and they have known each other for a year, and they've been in this sort of companionship for a year. So why did you start the story there and not with him alone and then meeting her? Because I think traditionally that might be how it would be started, where you'd have where he is this sort of well, I mean, I guess broken to a degree person, and then he meets or encounters Broken, and then he kind of comes out of his out of himself.
I think because it's not really, it wouldn't really be worth reading, right? Like this is something that I actually have against a lot of modern literary fiction. I went to grad school, by the way, and had to read a lot of it, and it's atrocious. Not to the fault of the authors a lot of the time too. They're often very skilled. The problem is there's a mistake about what we're doing when we're writing fiction. So it's relevant to your question, I promise. So what I encountered in grad school were people trying to write something they felt was reflective of life, but they took that as a conscious effort. And what they ended up doing is producing the meaningless, mundane details that don't contribute to the narrative arc of someone's life. And if I had started Conti out before, it would have been, I don't know, a dude like getting high off of the equivalent of psilocybin mushrooms in a cave doing nothing, and then happening across this like little girl maybe, and then a huge stretch of time of maybe just sending her into town so he doesn't have to deal with his contact in town. There's a lot of dry nothing, and that ends up being, maybe I could have explored the interiority of like his mindset at the time. But it's like, look, I can do that as the story is progressing, and it's going to be a lot more interesting if it's actually connected to the plot. And the plot really doesn't start until there is something that forces him out of his habitual mode of behavior, right? And
Hmm.
so I don't think his meaning of broken by itself was sufficient, right? Because if you look at the beginning, this is a bit spoilery, kind of, almost not really. He treats Broken like a thrall. He even thinks of her, this is my thrall, my follower. Like, I'm the cult
Hmm.
leader, she is the follower. Over the progression of the story, he actually starts to think of her as essentially his like adopted daughter. Like, I'm actually responsible for this little girl. Like, I actually need to be a decent role model. Actually, I should teach her things,
Hmm.
and make sure she's cared for instead of just, making sure she's anesthetized against the pain so she's functional.
Hmm.
Um, and I think starting the story backward it would have made Conti perhaps an unlikable character, right? There's a reason why we have this disdain for the basement dwelling troglodyte, right? Who just does nothing but gets high and plays video games. And some of those guys, if they're lucky enough to have girlfriends, they treat them like their moms, right? And they're miserable. If they have kids, they just ignore them. We don't respect those people, and you don't want to present your character at a point at which the reader hates them because they're just going to stop reading. Like, you can justify it all you want for the rest of the book. It doesn't really matter if there's like did not finish the DNF, boom, in chapter 1 or 2 or 3. Like, you're done. You're dead. It's like, well,
Hmm.
if I would have gotten to round 4, I would have won the boxing match. It's like, but dude, you got knocked out in round 3. It doesn't
Hmm.
matter if you would have won later.
Hmm. So she then doesn't have much impact on him in that way then for the first year of him knowing her, and then where the story is, she is starting to, or there's something that makes him start having that connection with her.
uh, yeah, it's a danger that they find. Like, they both have this. Well, she's following whatever he says because she's like a little girl and doesn't know any better.
Hmm.
And he's obsessed with revenge, so she becomes obsessed with whatever he's obsessed with because, even though he doesn't think of her that way, like, Conti's basically her surrogate dad, so she looks up to him as a model. And so there's a kind of codependent. As far as Conti is still in this rut, if you will. The relationship is like, what's the word I'm looking for? Not malignant. That's not the right word. Mal dysfunctional, um, codependence, and Conti needs an inciting incident of some kind, something that forces a change, that will allow that relationship to mean something, right? Because otherwise, it's like, you think about it, it's not just having kids that turn someone into a good parent. Now, some people
Mm.
have kids, and then all of a sudden, something else in their life happens, and then they change. But it's never just the one variable. It's a couple variables culminating together that announce out loud, like, "Hey, you know, I don't know if you want to do the JBP thing, but like clean your room, Bucko. Like straighten
Mhm.
yourself out. You're not doing too great.
Right. Okay. So okay. All right. Okay. So this is a. Okay. So this is a standalone book, right? Or is it not a standalone book? Because I'm seeing One Smoke : So is One Smoke. Book one. There we are. Right. So it is a series. Okay. So how big is the series going to be, do you think? Or do you know?
I don't quite know, but that's because I write very episodically. So, like, even though this is a novel, you'll notice each chapter has a very wrapped up conclusion. The chapters are also enormous relative to normal chapter length. They're like 40, 50, 60, 80 pages long. So,
Hmm.
they're like more like short stories that in and of themselves are self-contained. A couple bleed over into each other. But I find myself drawn toward, let's say, serial short fiction more than the grand, adventure. And maybe that's partly a consequence of trying to keep things small and local.
Hmm.
It might be trauma from writing Salt, Sand, and Blood and having this big grand thing, and then like just going and running, fleeing for my dear life in the opposite direction.
Right.
But the series is going to be that way. So like the first book is essentially Conti's character arc across, you could say, 11 very deeply interconnected stories. But I already have the manuscript for a set of short stories with all different characters for each one. Some that appear in Broken, One Smoke Broken, others that don't. And I'm already working on the sequel that takes place about 4 years later, centering around Broken and a different character that does show up as a very minor character in the first book named Callan. And uh, but if you started out reading the second book in the series, you're not going to be totally lost, right? Obviously, it always helps if you read the stuff that comes before. You are more familiar with the setting. You have less to learn all of a sudden.
Mhm.
But because of that episodic nature, you pick up the second book, you read the first chapter, you have a good sense of, okay, I understand what's going on. Um, and really, you could read each chapter. You would have to read them in order. Unlike my set of short stories, you could read those in any order that you wanted, really.
Mhm.
Um, though you should read them in the order they're presented, because then it'll unravel a big, long, interconnected story. But yeah, because of the nature of the way that I write, it is a series, but it will feel like separate serialized entities when you read them.
Okay. Yeah. I'm doing something similar on Substack with the Deadland stuff. Except those are way shorter. Those are something I mean, the shortest of them are about 500 words. The longest so far, probably, I don't know if they hit 1,000. If they hit 1,500 to 2,000, possibly. They're just sort of as long as they need to be, and those kind of tie themselves up in a bow by the end. But they're all kind of this serialized existence of this father and son in a land, well, in a city at the moment, an unnamed city that is taken over by the undead. And I like the idea of sort of the Terry Pratchett idea of having like the larger world and lots of stories that some are connected, some of them are not, that take place in that world, and you don't have to read them in any order. They just kind of build a bigger picture of the world that they inhabit. So I'm kind of doing with the sci-fi stuff, because Eye of the Universe, Red Saints, and the Kodiak stuff are all in one universe at different times, but yeah, they are all in one universe. Uh, right. So your series though is going to follow on chronologically, at least. There is going to be that constant of, well, at least in the first two, that constant of broken.
Yeah, so so far everything I've written is in chronological order. I know there's a set of stories that I've gotten a couple of them done. I'm gonna write 12 of them and try to get some people together to do like a literary magazine. And those take place across the time from some of them even before the first book and then across past when the second book ends. But they are much more, those are much more isolated. They follow the same character. And so for the most part, those are releases I do plan to be in chronological order as I go through the One Spoke series. So I kind of want to do this on and off thing where it's like, here's a mainstay book, here's some stories, here's a mainstay book, here's some stories, here's a mainstay book, something like that. For the really the purpose you just mentioned, right? When you have this setting, it's fun to flesh out different parts of the world. You learn more about the world yourself as an author as go into the trenches in a particular location because you can world build out the idea of a town. But when you write a story in the town, all of a sudden you need particular people with particular lives. They have relationships and then they like have businesses and places they work. And once you put the conflict in, well, what's under threat? What's around them? And what are the environmental factors, the potential threats lurking either within or without. And so you end up getting a much richer world by taking a break from the perspectives of the main characters and venturing out. And I also think that this shift towards serialization is perhaps a good thing. I don't know if it's good or bad or if it's neutral, but it reminds me of some of the pulp era stuff that I actually like. And I actually would really like to see a return. And I think it would be more in modern people's taste where we're constantly consuming short form content that we might be able to, I don't know, get people back interested into reading if we had short form content to offer, right? Because in the modern day, you hand someone a book and they're just intimidated. Like they don't even open it. But if you say, "Hey, read my 500 to 1500 to maybe 2000 word like microfiction," like okay, like that's I can read that in a few minutes. It's much more digestible. I feel like I've read something, I've done something good for myself, and then that really opens the doorway for people. So, um, doing a lot of the shorter stories as opposed to the gigantic grand tomes. I hope that works out, and I hope it becomes, I hope anything becomes marketable, to be frank. But
Mm.
yeah,
There's something in, I think, learning how to tell a story with that kind of constraint. Like I can't remember when it was a few years ago now. There was on Minds, there was the Daniel and Angel story thing that kind of has gone away, unfortunately. But it was something that was really fun to do. Just you have that constraint of okay, you have 500 words. Okay, 500 words. What story can I tell with 500 words on this theme? Okay, right. And it really engages the brain. And I think it's good for. It's just a really good. It was just a really good exercise, um, for a writer just to kind of go like, okay, I have, so this is the beginning of it, and I feel like I'm going a little bit. It's like it's good for writing and editing because you're like, okay, this I can maybe trim a bit here, and then have more meat a bit later on. And okay, that's maybe a bit too meaty. We can maybe shift this to here, and then okay, and how are we rounding this off? We need to round this off in a satisfying way. And we can't have it just stop because I'm at 475 words and now I have 25 words to end it. Damn. Like it kind of engages multiple kind of layers of my brain. I was like, okay, this is a great thing to do. And talking of editing, you also edit stuff. You have an editing service, right? At Wild Owl Lit. So how did you get into
yeah.
that?
So editing, after editing a lot of my own work, and I've had fellow authors ask me to look at their own material, and then plus going to grad school, and then also teaching English composition and English literature. They were just introductory courses, but they were a nice refresher coming back because I didn't do an undergraduate in anything involving writing or literature at all. I did exercise physiology. A lot of schools call it exercise science. I was going to go into physical therapy.
Mm.
Didn't do that. But I did do grad school for creative writing, and then that a couple of years really is about I think four total, two in person, two online. There's a little bit of overlap between those. Um, I had gained enough skill and familiarity with the technical aspect of writing, and had a decent amount of experience that I thought, well, I'm going to be a better writer the more that I read and the more that I work in writing rather than work some other job. And to be frank, you're not going to be that much of a better writer uh, teaching you will to an extent. Like I said, I got some experience teaching undergraduates, but uh, the modern state of American academia, particular over here in West Virginia,
Mm.
was so poor that it was just, maybe three students could write passably. A quarter of them were functionally illiterate, and the rest, you just hope to learn something along the way.
Mm.
There wasn't that much to, you wanted to engage, you wanted to push, you couldn't really do it. So I wanted to move away from teaching, so I did. And I just started marketing myself. I asked people who were in the know. I know an editor, a couple editors actually locally. Um, Also a shout out to Fallon Edits, Fallon Clark. She is a story coach, but she helped me rebrand myself. I've been doing editing for about a year or so before I had consulted with her, but she really helped me out and niche myself and focus my editing. Though to be honest, I'm finding the demand for essentially line level and developmental edits is higher than, let's say, stylistic prose level uh, recommendations, and so I might end up kind of unniching here soon. But that's how I got into it, is wanting to really live as this sounds really pretentious. I really hate it. Live as the artist and in the art. So I wanted to do things, make my living off of writing. And if that's editing and helping other authors, that's great. If it's ghostwriting, that's still great because I'm still producing. And then hopefully here one day, I'll have enough fiction out there, or even nonfiction. Right? I've got a few nonfiction books that I want to write as well, that I can, be an author. Like, it's my profession and my occupation.
Mm. Right. You mentioned the type of editing there. Was it prose? Say it again, sorry.
Yeah, so the reason it's called the Wild Isle Style Guide is because my specialty, my niche really is in approaching the composition. Now I can and still actually do standard developmental editing. A lot of the times when people think of editing, they think of one of two things. They think of like proofing and basic line edits, which are more about, okay, is this are there typos? Is this grammatically correct? That's proofing. Line edits, is this consistent and is it clear? That's the
Mhm.
main thing with line edits, right? Like, are these sentences wonky so that they're getting in the way? Then there's developmental level editing, and these have different names depending on who you ask. If you go around the internet, you might hear them called different things.
Mm.
But developmental editing is at the story level. Like, you go over to fallonedits.com, you'll see that that's primarily what she focuses on is this story, is the plot structured correctly? Are the characters properly characterized? Is this
Mm.
paced well? That kind of thing. Where the style guide, as what I focus on, are what interested me in grad school, and those are elements of composition such as rhyme, rhythm, the use of figurative language. So typically, you think of like metaphor and simile, but also getting close to theme is the use of symbols, right? Because once you start speaking figuratively, open yourself up to essentially the same type of devices that you use in poetry. And I really like to instill a kind of, again, I apologize for being pretentious, music into the work, because you can tell the difference when you pick up a piece of fiction and you start reading it, and there is a natural rhythm and flow and cadence that itself is engaging and pleasant and communicates things to the reader alongside the actual content of the piece. This is something that, I say unfortunately, um, goes unnoticed in the same way that, like, if you've got like a four-piece rock band, like the bass goes unnoticed until you take it away. So a lot of people uh, might lose me at this point, but I swear you'll notice, like, the real classic example. Go pick up Robert E. Howard's Conan the Barbarian. I believe it's the Tower of the Elephant, and he describes the streets of Zamora in the very opening paragraph, I think. There's other sections where Robert E. Howard, sometimes he gets a little bit wonky as pulp does, but there are some beautiful sections in there that come from his studying, I believe, Anglo-Saxon poetry.
Hmm.
Another book that encompasses what I'm talking about is Cormac McCarthy. The Road does so to a decent amount, but there are certain sections of, say, the book Blood Meridian, which I'm obsessed with, that really evoke the feeling of the place that's being described in such a way that you could take a boring scene like these people crossing the desert and make that itself engaging without really anything happening but the experience of being in the desert in the night while heat lightning is striating the sky and reflecting off the wagon wheels like hoops of fire, right? Like, I'm trying to remember pieces of it,
Hmm.
but that's my major, let's say, focus with editing. I do thematic editing as well, where I try to coach people through my process, where I really, this is very difficult, it's much more intensive, where you present the question and then you go on that exploration with the author where they're trying to tackle this question. And to do that, they have to explore symbols. This is a little bit like doing a Jungian dream analysis, which takes a long time and a lot of labor to not it, because it's not exactly like, okay, you should put these pieces here. You look at what was written down and you see what presents itself, what symbols, what opportunities there are for certain symbols to be expanded upon. Because typically, and I'll stop talking because I've been going on forever. But typically, what I find with a thematic analysis of an author is that the symbols are already there prematurely, and you just need to start to open them up, and they start multiplying themselves in this kind of discovery of the theme of the story in a more articulate fashion.
Hmm. The thing, the kind of the music that you were describing there, like the kind of the tone, like the tone of imagery and things like that. It must be tricky in a sense, because I would think, like, how would you put that? So let's say a writer comes to you and they want more of that kind of thing in their work. How do you approach doing that without kind of compromising their voice? Because it seems like maybe like they're, without kind of compromising their voice, compromising their style, and almost imparting your own into it. How do you
Yeah, that's
avoid
a
that?
super big danger. Yeah, so that's a huge danger actually, and I see that all the time with editing of any kind. Um, and the way that I go about it is, I have like an hour consultation, regardless of what editing package my clients purchase. And I spend a lot of that asking them what they feel their voice is, what they admire, what they might want to emulate. And I get a bit of a reading list. And then I will go and actually read authors that they admire, So I want to get a feel for what they think they're aiming at. Now, that doesn't mean the end result is going to be that way, but at least it gives me something aside from myself, because otherwise it's just me thinking what I do, which isn't what the client has come to me for. They've come to develop their own voice. Um, Part of this, though, if you're genuinely trying to help somebody else, it's actually difficult to skew their voice too much. The reason this happens is if you're an editor and you come with this mindset of, okay, I have studied the established norms, the what do we call these nowadays? The conventions, right, of the time and of the genre. And if you think that, like, one, your own voice is not going to come through in your work. It's going to sound generic. I guarantee you that if you are uh, robotically following conventions that you've learned and you're not and your own exploratory process challenging yourself, you're a robot. Like your voice is going to be replaceable, probably by Chat GPT here soon. But if you're not doing that, it's difficult because I'm going to use a martial arts metaphor because this is how I think about it. So when I studied traditional Chinese martial art, there
Which
was the
one?
tradition, and so you start out learning the tradition, right? You learn the form, but
Which
like the
one?
way that
Which
they
one?
teach you to move.
Which one? Which martial art?
Okay, so it was a collaboration is the wrong word. So my Sifu studied in Macau, China, under a number of people, and when he brought it over to America, he systematized it, but it really should have been separate. As far as I've researched back, it looks like uh, a combination of like Choi Li Foot and something else. So Choi Li Foot, I think, is a combination of Hung Gar and Shaolin Kung Fu.
Mhm.
And that was very representative. So we had a system of different animal styles. We had Tiger and Crane taught separately, but
Mhm.
I don't think my Sifu learned them separately. I think he learned them at the same as that, like Hung Gar, like Tiger Crane, and then
Mhm.
separated them. There was Manus Fist, but it was weird. It was like a combination of Northern and Southern Manus Fist styles. So again, I think he learned that probably two different versions from two different people, and then taught them as one thing. The same thing with like Eagle Claw. There was like because in China, generally speaking, there's like a Northern and a Southern. Um, just due, I think, of climate and then the environment
Mhm.
people are in, and also the genetics of the people, right? Everything in the
Mhm.
north tends to be bigger, stretched out longer, more expanded. Everything in the
Yep.
south tends to be shorter, more grappling focused, lower. But yeah, the style, and I think the spelling for this was just like whatever he threw together. So I've not been able to reverse engineer I believe Cantonese and not Mandarin, which made
Mhm.
it harder even. It was like Chiwed Kun, and I know
Mhm.
Kun is fist. But I don't know if the Chiwed was like just this bastardized pronunciation of something in Cantonese. I don't know if it's supposed to be like chi, like chi energy, and then like wed might even be like English, like to wed things together, because it was like the 80s in wheeling. So people just would just, I got to brand myself something, and I am
Mhm.
cobbling together all these styles I learned. So boom.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, but it it has a lot of similarity to if you look at like the Shaolin Animal Fist, it looks similar to that. Or again, Choi Li Foot is another style that's derivative of that, looks similar. Or Hungar
Mhm.
for that matter, looks quite similar. Anyway,
Mhm.
the martial arts metaphor, you learn the tradition, but if you actually learn to fight, and we did hard sparring, so like you actually had to move, you had to learn to utilize, and like unfortunately, tragically, a lot of Chinese martial arts are taught as this performative dance, and they lose that martial aspect. I don't know how I was fortunate enough to be part of a style where we actually did still fight, but we did. And what ends up happening is the style molds to fit you, right? Because your body is particular and you're fighting other people who have particular advantages and you have particular advantages. And so it'd be it's just impractical for you naturally to perfectly copy somebody else or to even perfectly emulate the style. Same thing with writing, right? So if I'm genuinely trying to help somebody, my I'm going to get influences that they're interested in, that they admire, right? But I'm also going to have my influence on them. But those are only going to rub off insofar as they fit onto that author. As long as I am not, let's say, saying to them, you must do X,
Mm.
right? Because of conventions, right? Because to be honest, it's moronic. What you say is this working, and why is it working? Which is something I am grateful going to grad school for, because they made us do that. They said, read this book, write a paper, tell me why it works or why it doesn't. It
Mm.
wasn't tell me what conventions or devices they use. It was no. Does this work for you? Does it not work for you? And why? So you get to see behind the, let's say, behind why the conventions are they are. Because, like, I don't know, like maybe 90% of the time, like some basic rule for writing is true and it absolutely applies. But then there's like a 10% of the time where the circumstances are different. And following that just cripples the author. And so, again, sorry to ramble on for so long, but yeah, if you are genuinely trying to say what works for this author, what doesn't work, not how does this person fit into a box, you can, not just color them with not even your own brush, the brush of whatever painted you, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. Like 90% of making a cake is basically the same across most cakes. It's the 10% that makes it either a bad cake or a cake you want to eat. That type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Okay. So have you ever sort of thought of branching out from fantasy into something else, into a different genre? Or have you stuck with fantasy? Because I think you mentioned I was on your show. I was on Wild Owl, and you mentioned like you'd written a bunch of stuff, and I think not published it. And the first, maybe the first thing you put out was the book that shall not be named, I guess, and then One Smoke came after. So what
Yeah.
during those were you kind of bouncing around, or were you sticking with fantasy mainly?
So I have mainly stuck with fantasy. When I did a lot of writing exercises, particularly again in grad school, I would adventure out. I do really want to. I have a lot of ideas. I want to do a historical fiction piece set in Wheeling. Again, I want to draw from my environment and see what I could come up with. There's a lot of interesting history. We used to have like a big crime for Wheeling, a big crime boss, a guy named Big Bill Elias, uh, who is your classic like zoot suit gangster. So it's kind of cool that we had that. But aside from that, I do want to expand out and do some science fiction, which partly because it intimidates me.
Mm.
But also I want to try something. I want to try something literary. So every time I come across someone who is more pretentious than I am, and I tell them I write fantasy, and they give me that look like, "Oh, pat you on the head, you're writing for kids," that I can like hit them with a book that
Mm-hmm.
they can appreciate. I actually kind of want to literally hit them with a book, but at least to be able to shove that into their hands to
Is
show
that
that
why
I
you've got it in hardcover, so you can hit them with the book?
yeah, that's the main reason, right?
Yeah,
And yeah,
more
until society
wieldable.
collapses, yeah, until society collapses, and I can lug my freaking shotgun around. Um, but yeah, something literary, I definitely want to try my hand at. I even want to try to write like a more romance focused story, just because I want to explore as an author. I say this to authors all the time, partly as a bit of motivation, but also because I want to remind myself, when you write a story, yeah, you're producing the work and you want that to be good, but also you are recreating and improving yourself, right? You're making yourself more of a person. You're learning along with the characters, right? You're producing something of value and then making yourself more valuable. And I think challenging oneself as an author and doing things that are uncomfortable and unfamiliar will make you better. And as the producer of the fiction, if you only stay in your comfort zone for your whole life, you're really truncating what you're capable of, I think.
Mm. So so try and bounce out of your comfort zone. Yeah, I mean, I think that's something I've tried to do. I mean, Eye of the Universe was a big kind of jump out of my comfort zone in a way. I mean, so was Red Saints, to be fair. Like both of those, I just sort of they were both kind of what ifs. It's like what if with Red Saints it was what if there was a what if I wrote a book where there really wasn't a protagonist, there were two antagonists, neither of whom were particularly good for the universe, but who were kind of diametrically opposed. And it was this sort of toxic authoritarian versus a very toxic libertarian. And like let's see how they kind of let's see what happens when they clash. All right. So they're clashing. Why are they clashing? Okay. And how do I get myself in those headspaces to write both of those characters? Because it's in first person, so it's from their perspectives. So I'm like, okay, right, I'll go method. How has this person gotten to here? And similar with Eye of the Universe, it was just I think that one was a lot. I had to my friend Lee, who people will recognize as from the Alchemy Labs. Well, obviously that's where we are, but from the Streets of Mir stuff, as Cassius Valentine. He sort of kind of pushed me to writing it because I was like, I've got this idea for a book, and it's there. It was like right there. I'm like, I don't know if starting this is a good idea because it's what the kind of book that really caught the darkness, and particularly at the time, I was living in Japan at the time, and as lovely and kawaii as Japan is, it is also in Tokyo in particular and its surrounding areas is also very isolating and very strange and very kind of almost dreamlike at times. Like it's a very strange place to be. And I found that 6 months after leaving Japan, I was still recovering from the damage Japan had done to me. From being on trains where no one was speaking, even though they're completely crowded, dead silence, and walking around in streets where everyone is just like no one's looking up, no one's looking down, no one's looking at you. It's just like and being alone all the time. And I'm like, I've got this book in my head that is really, it's going to bring a lot of that stuff out potentially. It's like, well, then why aren't you writing it? I'm like, yeah, okay, good point. Why am I not writing it? Because this is probably be the perfect time to write it. And that's how it kind of began. And it was almost intentionally putting myself in discomfort. But it felt like it paid off. It's one of those that I think it paid off. I would because I wrote it, but it's a bit from based on what people say, it seems to have paid off. Yeah. And you mentioned, I think you related in some ways to the character in One Smoke, because you mentioned like there was a kind of dark episode. I don't know how much you want to talk about that, but
yeah, we can talk about it. So I've written about this a number of times. I think in my blog posts, there's 3 of them on the Hagakure, and one of them I talk about this, where I think I was in undergrad, maybe freshman or sophomore, maybe might have even been at the end of high school. I can't remember, but I remember I was spending a lot of time just doing nothing, like playing way too many video games, wasting my life. And occasionally I would start having this thought, and the thought would be like, what are you doing? And I would verbalize it before I knew what I was doing, right? And this was going on for months. And then eventually I started impulsively out of nowhere saying, what are you doing with your life? And
Mm.
that really scared the hell out of me. When all of a sudden, like something in you is asking that question, it's like, okay, hey, your conscience is upset with you in a
Mm.
way that it's now not putting up with anymore. And this coincided with a bit of weavery, actually. This is a fun bit of part of the story. So I had seen the, what is it, the 1989 version of Berserk for the first time then.
Mm.
And there's a scene in that where, for those of you who haven't seen it, and you should see it, it's actually, it's a piece of art, to be frank. Griffith, he's this leader of this band of mercenaries. He's recently come very close to achieving his dream of he wants to become king. His knights are there are now knights, his commanders of his mercenary camp, they're being risen into the nobility. So he gets to talk to the princess. They're outside talking in front of this fountain, in front of this massive staircase. Well, at the bottom of the staircase is the protagonist, Guts. Guts, who looks up to Griffith, who wants desperately to gain his respect and to be Griffith's friend. And he overhears this conversation. And, Charlotte, the princess, is talking to Griffith, the commander, and she's like, all these, great friends. It's so impressive. He's like, I really respect all of my men and the sacrifices they make, but I can't really call them friends because I don't really consider them my equal. It's only someone who I consider equal to me that I can have the respect and friendship for, even if that meant that we came to blows, right, in war. And Guts hears this at the bottom of the stairs, and then he hears, I would only really consider someone my equal if they too had a dream as big and grand and ambitious as mine. And Guts doesn't believe he has any ambition or any dream. He just goes into war and fights.
Mm.
Little does he know that he's living his most fulfilled life. And so when he hears this, it tears him into little pieces inside. And that, like, I realized, like, that was me at the bottom of the stairs,
Mm.
right? Like, did I even really have a dream? And in Jungian psychology, this would be considered an elevation of consciousness. Now, I hate the words for everything in Jungian psychology because they sound like mystic and hokey. I
Mm.
wish he called them anything else. But the
Mhm.
elevation of consciousness, all that means is you become aware of part of yourself that was there, but you just weren't paying attention to, usually because it's uncomfortable, right? Like when you went to write the story, you had all this deep-seated loneliness that you needed to process and engage with, and it's like horrifying and scary and depressing, and like, of course, it just hurts to delve into it. But when you become aware of it, it's like, okay, now I have to. Like, I've now seen into the jaws of hell, and there's only one way forward, and that is to go down from this elevated height that I've now reached and go through hell, right? That's like you think religious symbolism where Jesus has to go through the desert. By the way, I'm not a religious person, but I end up using religious metaphors. So if anyone's
Mhm.
likes that, cool. If you're offended, I'm sorry. But for me with Conti, right, in the story for once with Wand Smoke, that was reflective of that time in my life after that. Because after that, I had seen, I had become aware of what I wanted to achieve that I had put aside. So at that time, I had given up this because in high school, early high school, I thought I want to try and be an author. And what high school told me is that's unrealistic. Don't be such a
Mm.
fool. And so
Right.
I gave that up. And then I realized actually, no, I actually do want to do that. And I'm
Mm.
like way far away. Like that's like a tiny glimmer in this vast distance. And I'm like on this island way over here, and there's this massive black ocean full of leviathans. And like I felt like, I stand no chance. And but that star in the distance is like the only light by which I could guide myself forward. because at that point, like now it's too late, right? Your conscience is telling you, what are you doing with your life? Why are you not pursuing that? Because you
Mm.
can see it. And that and the distance from that goal tortured me for years and years and years, dealt with terrible suicidal depression. I have a bunch of people I know, and friends, even close friends, who have suffered from drug addiction. And the way that one of them in particular describes me is like a drug addict who never figured out that you can use drugs to like solve that problem. Right? It's like you just didn't figure out that you could shoot up heroin and you wouldn't feel that way anymore. So you were like in misery for years, which I'm glad for, by the way. That's a big problem here, really, heroin epidemic.
Mm.
But yeah, that was really that actually gave birth to the book Salt, Sand, and Blood, which took me like 6 years to write. It was just like this miserable, horrific half decade of really practicing becoming what I wanted to be,
Mm.
and suffering the whole way through, bumbling blindly, trying to, let's say, trying to get there, and then also suffering the realization of what it means, right? Because you have this grandiose, I don't know if you had this, and maybe some people listening out there, if you're other authors, experience this, where you think, oh, to be an author, it's great, you like get to write these books, and you have like these fans, and then like you've got this life that you want to live, and you have this idealized form, and you really realize like no, that's not what it's like at all. Like you're really struggling with, for me anyway, struggling with like imposter syndrome, trying really hard, never really knowing, like you don't have this objective standard until you put yourself out there for ridicule, like whether your work is good or not, and
Mm.
then like trying to get someone to even look at it. So you don't even know. It's like I'm totally unknown. Is it because I suck, or is it because I'm unlucky? Do I just need to keep doing this? Am I wasting my, like, you get
Mm.
that the whole slew of questions, and having to learn that that is the journey that you're on, and you better learn to love that, or you're going to be Sisyphus, right?
Mm.
Pushing a rock up the hill meaninglessly unless you learn to find meaning in your task.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's that when you first start, yeah. It's like it's when you put the book out, I think, that you realize it's like, oh, okay. I don't know it's an unrealistic expectation, I suppose. Very few books just catch fire, but they're the ones you hear about, right? The ones that it's like, oh, this guy, he just self-published this thing, and by the next day he had 1,500 5-star reviews, and it's just like, what? Or like you hear about the guy who wrote The Martian, the original like The Martian story before it was made into the movie. I think he published that on his website, I think, and it ended up being published because someone read it there and loved it, and it went out. And it's just the sheer amount of authors. There are far more than you think, and they're all putting stuff out, and you've got to kind of just keep plugging away and climb those stairs, one step at a time, and eventually you get to the top. It's just, I think the other thing that people lose, I think people assume that's a sprint. They assume that you've got to kind of sprint up the stairs. You can just walk up them. It's fine. Like, it's not necessarily a sprint. It's a marathon often. Particularly if you're, I don't know, particularly if you don't have necessarily like a support network that is robust, or you don't have like a big social media presence or something like that. Like, you're starting actually at the bottom and take just slowly just grinding your way up the stairs, and eventually you get there. But it's just a long old journey, and it's a journey that doesn't even really end. I don't know if there is a top of the stairs even, because you just keep going and going and going. Because the second you get to the top of those stairs, it's not a case of, oh, okay, well, I'm here. It's like, okay, where's the next staircase that I can keep going on? Because at the moment The moment you think you've finished is the moment I don't know, the moment you kind of part of you dies. So just keep going, keep going. Particularly with something like writing, there's always room to improve. Like even if you're considered perfect, it's like no, you're not. There's still something there that you can work on. All right. So, where can people find you and get in touch with you and things like that?
Yeah, so obviously you can go to my website, wildilelit.com. That's where I like to send everybody. I'm on a bunch of other places. So on YouTube, Wild Isle Literature is the name of my channel. On social media, if you look up MarQuese D. Liddle, and my name is a bastardized spelling of the French. So it's MarQuese, and then D, and then Liddle with D's, Liddle. Run those all together after an @ symbol, and you can find me. Oh, look, even on YouTube, MarQuese D. Liddle is right there. I'm on Minds.com. I like Minds the most of all the social media. I've met a lot of really cool friends there. The writing community there is excellent. I really feel like you get to know people and that they're kind. Whereas I'm over on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. The few people I follow on Twitter are cool as well, but Twitter it's like this stream. I can't keep up with it, to be frank. And Facebook is so flooded with people that you like no one notices anybody. It's like being in the city where no one looks at each other.
Yep.
And then I don't even know why I do know why I'm on Instagram. I happened to have found a client through Instagram. It seems like there are some authors and people who are looking for editors there, so I'm there as well.
Oh,
I don't
also
know
a
if you're an
contact
old
form.
person. Yeah. Yeah, if you want to contact me, by the way, for the podcast, I'm always looking for topics or potential guests. So go over to that contact form, and if you want to recommend a topic or if you'd like to appear, like let me know who you are, how you know me, whether I happen to know you or come across your stuff, and like maybe you can jump on the Wild Isle podcast. Sorry, they're shilling myself a bit. But yeah, oh, if you're old, I'm on LinkedIn as well. But typically, if I don't know you, that probably won't add you on LinkedIn. LinkedIn's a little more personal.
And of course, One Smoke is here. One Smoke Broken is here. Kindle, paperback, and hardcover if you want to bludgeon someone with it. All right, and you can
Please do.
Yeah, definitely bludgeon someone with it. Wait, hang on, is that breaking TOS? Maybe don't do that. In Minecraft. Play Minecraft with the book. You can find my stuff here on Amazon. Fantasy, if you like fantasy, things like Four Guardian series, Out the Ashes, Burning Plains, Serpent Slayer, and the Empire of Fire. Shorter form stuff is right here in the middle, from Corner of the Eye down to Trial by Fire, the Kodiak series. Also, The Eye of the Universe, if you like some sci-fi, and Red Saints, if you're into sci-fi as well. And I'll plug the second channel here, which is Drunk Wordsmith, where audio things are happening. We have The Eye of the Universe Chapter 1 up there in audio form, and a poem as well, If, by Rudyard Kipling. I think probably more of that will go up. I've got my eye on the Raven, and I've got my eye on Ozymandias as well. So we'll see. Also, Red Saints. A couple of chapters of Red Saints will probably go on there as well. So keep an eye out for them. Sub to those, and like, comment, and subscribe here. Yeah, I think that's pretty much everything. So, MarQuese, thank you for coming on.
Very welcome. Thank you for having me, Matt. I really like coming on here and getting to meet all of your viewers and listeners.
And thank you for having me on as well on Wild Isle. That episode is number 27, I think.
Yeah, episode 27, writing cast 12. So either if you're looking for it on the main podcast, it'll be 27. But if you're just looking at the playlist for the writing cast, it'll be 12. It's always listed with both numbers, so you should be able to find it pretty easily.
All right, brilliant. Right, well, take care, everyone, and I'll see you next time.